kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I am Annie Klaff, and then Brendan Mortensen, our MASN insider, is in Cleveland right now covering the series, the 4-game series against the Guardians. Had a bit of a rough start to this 4-game set, but otherwise, how are things going for you in Cleveland?
Well, the weather is nicer than any of the other road trips that I've been on. I've been to Phoenix, which was about 100 degrees, Anaheim, which was about 100 degrees. So the fact that it's about 80 and sunny in Cleveland is nice. It's a nice change of pace. The Orioles, as you mentioned, have not been playing great baseball over the first 2 games of this series, which would make things a little bit nicer, but at least the weather is nice. So I'll take that.
Right. At least you can get some sun in, a little bit of that, not too hot, not too cold for the second half. But obviously you mentioned a rough start to the second half. We're going to get into all of that jazz, especially, of course, with the trade deadline coming up as well. So we heard from Mike Elias, not specifically, but on an interview on the radio with MLB Network. So we're going to dive into that. But first, we have a lot of injury updates and news. The big one is that Zack Efflin is coming back, making his start tonight for the Orioles in Game 3 against the Guardians. He has had a very interesting season, had some injury early on, and then came back at the end of May, and he had some kind of starts that weren't characteristic to Zack Efflin, where we knew he was going to be able to locate the ball well and not walk a lot of guys. But then, so there were only maybe 3 starts in that spurt after coming back from the injured list in that time frame where he had quality starts. And then after that, it started to go downhill again, which is where you kind of sensed that something wasn't right. So he hit the injured list again with some back discomfort. Now he's making another comeback, so hopefully he can get back to some typical Zack Efflin outing performance.
Yeah, it's been a really weird season for Zack Efflin. He starts the year with 3 straight quality starts, 6 innings in each of them, 3 earned runs or fewer in each of them. Then he hits the injured list for a while, comes back about a month later, looks solid in his return back against the Angels, and then has a bad start against the Nationals, has that weird start in Boston where it was just pouring rain and he was trying to pitch through it, and then gets back to form, and then it seems like something's off. And over his last 3 starts, he's allowed 17 earned runs, and I think over just 9 innings of work. So it's not the Zack Efflin that we were accustomed to seeing at the beginning of the season, or even during that middle stretch where it seemed like he was back to his old self. So the hope for Zack Efflin is that he, puts together a nice start today in Cleveland, and he gets back to being that Zack Efflin. Of course, we were going to get into the trade deadline conversation, and you can put 2 and 2 together in terms of some of the comments that Mike Elias has made about the current state of where things stand, where the Orioles are in the standings, and how they will potentially operate surrounding guys on expiring contracts. Zack Efflin is one of those guys on an expiring deal. So this is an important start for Zack Efflin to get back on track. It's an important start for interim manager Tony Mansolino and the guys in that clubhouse that are just trying to win games every day. And Zack Efflin gives you a good chance to do that. But of course, from an organizational standpoint and the deadline that is looming now in 8 days, it is an important start for Zack Efflin, given the circumstances and what his future might hold in the coming weeks.
Right, and especially because we kind of just know what's in the tank for Zack Efflin. We know that he is a really good pitcher. He was supposed to be the ace going into this season. Then, of course, with the name of the game and how the story has gone for the Orioles pitching staff the last 2 years, there's been a lot of injuries. So hopefully Zack Efflin can kind of put the pieces back together, and maybe a second injured list stint and some more full recovery status will help for Efflin, especially because this team really needs that right now. Obviously, the goal goals and trajectory for the end of the season. And the second half of the season is very different from, say, earlier on when there was still a lot of time left. But again, it is the second half. So there's been a lot of focus towards 2026, but still you want the best out of Zack Efflin and the rest of this pitching staff. Another one of those injury updates we have is Grayson Rodriguez. This was on the 18th, but we found out about another setback in his kind of way to get back to the big leagues and being healthy again. This was a shutdown of his most recent rehab assignment after some right elbow discomfort, which is what we saw from him earlier on in spring training. So that's never really great to hear, especially when you have your number one guy in Zack Efflin and then Grayson Rodriguez, who could have also been that number one guy, is shut down again.
Yeah, it's been a really, really strange season for Grayson Rodriguez. He hasn't been able to pitch in any games. We haven't seen him in the minors. He hasn't been rehabbing in that sense, but he has just been working back from injury, and it's been a bunch of different injuries for him. We heard coming into the season that, he was trying to figure out the lat issue, and that was, what kept him out for a lot of the time in 2022. And then in 2024, he has the shoulder inflammation, he has a muscle strain, and then early this year, he has the elbow triceps inflammation. That was kind of a mysterious injury in terms of what exactly was ailing him. And then in April, it's back to the lat muscle strain, which he has dealt with before. And he told us that he was trying to work on some things mechanically with his arm slot and delivery to try to avoid some of those lat injuries and keep the pressure off of, that muscle. And then, as you mentioned a few weeks ago, it's classified as elbow discomfort for Grayson Rodriguez. So it's hard to say exactly how those injuries are related, if some of those mechanical adjustments have put more stress on the elbow or vice versa with the lat. It's just been kind of a big mystery season for Grayson Rodriguez because we are not privy to everything that he is doing day to day. We get updates here and there, but the general takeaway is that it's not a great prognosis for Grayson Rodriguez. He is awaiting imaging and things like that. But anytime that you're out for this extended length of time and you're not able to get to the point where you are rehabbing and you are seeing game action and facing live hitters, it's tough. And this is one of the best young arms in this rotation, and you want him to be healthy and back in there for you. But we're going to have to wait and see what the prognosis is on him and what his potential timeline could look like.
Well, you mentioned that Rodriguez is one of the best arms in this rotation. Another one of those guys is Kyle Bradish. He is supposed to start his rehab assignment tomorrow, so that'll be huge just for him and coming back from a major injury last season. The Orioles have definitely been without him for, you feel it with the starting rotation of not having Kyle Bradish in there. Albert Suarez is supposed to face live hitters before August, so that is good. Cade Povich is still on his rehab assignment. He's registered 3 starts with the Tides and Aberdeen, but he has not gone more than 75 pitches or 4 1/3 innings yet. So hoping to see more out of Cade Povich and Keegan Aiken as well, because right now a huge storyline, at least going into the second half, is that the Orioles offense can put some runs on the board, but then they can't necessarily sustain it throughout the game. And we've seen a pretty exhausted bullpen as of right now, even after the All-Star break, and allowing a lot of walks to this pitching staff for the last number of games since the All-Star break. You can see some taxed bullpen arms right now. So getting Keegan Aiken back and having him on the injured list right now is definitely a bad thing for sure.
Yeah. I mean, interim manager Tony Manfilino mentioned it yesterday where he goes, Keegan Aiken is kind of an underrated piece that we're missing at this point. That's an important part of the bullpen to be another reliable lefty along with Gregory Soto. Grant Wolfram had a tough outing against Cleveland. He's shown some flashes, but Keegan Aiken is one of those just reliable, steady guys out of the pen that you don't have right now. He is outstanding entering a game with inherited runners. So he has done a great job of keeping the Orioles in a lot of games. But, it's funny how many, it's not funny, but it's a real microcosm of what the starting pitching injuries have looked like for the Orioles over the past 2 seasons, when we have just given injury updates on Zack Efflin, Kyle Bradish, Cade Povich, Tyler Wells, Albert Suarez and Grayson Rodriguez, that's an entire starting rotation in itself. Right. And it's good that you're getting Efflin back today. And Bradish has had a lot of positive developments. It seems like Albert Suarez is on the right track, as is Cade Povich. But man, that's a pretty good rotation of the guys that you just mentioned. So that's a really tough spot for the Orioles to be in. But, in general, I think with these injury updates outside of Grayson Rodriguez, things are pretty positive on the injury front in terms of guys coming back relatively soon. Adley Rutschman, another guy that is making a rehab start. He just started for AAA Norfolk yesterday as the designated hitter. Plan for him is to catch today on Wednesday as we are doing this podcast. And then Mansolino said he's a possibility for this weekend. Ryan Mountcastle is scheduled to be in AAA Norfolk at some point over the next few days. If all things go well, then he could be back tomorrow on Thursday. So those are some positive updates on the hitting front. There's pretty positive updates on the pitching front with Efflin and Bradish and Suarez and Povich as well. Obviously Grayson Rodriguez is the big detractor there, but I think in general, there are some dates circled on the calendar that you have to look forward to with big name pieces coming back.
Yeah, as far as our podcasts have gone and giving injury updates, I feel like this is definitely probably one of the more positive
ones. This is a happy one, especially considering we've done, a draft recap, a draft, preview. We haven't talked about injuries in a while, and they have unfortunately stacked up over the past, few weeks.
And I feel like also Albert Suarez is a guy that we haven't necessarily given a lot of attention to, and how big of a contributor that he would have been if he were on this big league roster since day one of the season, just kind of given what he did last year and filling in the shoes for a lot of injured guys in the rotation, being kind of a reliever and a starter hybrid, having that kind of versatility too. He would be a huge difference maker to this team from the start of 2025. I feel like he hasn't gotten a lot of attention from us this season just for what kind of difference he would have been able to make. But again, you did mention the positives in Adley Rutschman, Ryan Mountcastle. Hopefully you can see them soon. Chadwick Tromp as well, part of that kind of catcher relieving door of injuries. So he is on his rehab assignment with Aberdeen that started on the 18th. And down in the minor leagues as well, Samuel Basayo is out with some sore oblique, kind of whatever that's going on right now. I don't think he's hit the injured list, so I think we should be finding out more about that right now. But that's pretty much all the injury-related news and updates we have.
Are you sure? It feels like there's more. It feels like there's a list of things that we need to run down, trying to make sure that, we didn't miss anything. I suppose a smaller injury update that we don't know if is a long-term injury update or not. Dylan Carlson promoted to the big leagues yesterday. It's kind of a one-for-one swap with Luis Vasquez, infielder for outfielder. Tyler O'Neill was... Mansolino classified it as staying away from Tyler O'Neill yesterday, and if there was an injury in the outfield, they wanted Dylan Carlson there to be a fill-in, so it sounds like Tyler O'Neill was unavailable yesterday. Called it general soreness, so we don't really know what the injury to O'Neill is. He has not been back a long time since his last injured list stint, but hopefully O'Neill is not a candidate for the injured list. Mansolino said he didn't think he was, and we're going to learn some more information today. But that was the roster move yesterday. Dylan Carlson up as a kind of insurance policy if Tyler O'Neill ends up missing any sort of significant amount of time. But we'll find out more today if there is a move to the injured list for O'Neill. But Mansolino didn't think that was a potential move at this point.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because Tyler O'Neill, he's been kind of a Tyler O'Neill season where lots of injuries, of course, and we knew that
Sure.
was kind of to be expected. But Dylan Carlson, of course, is a good option to have just in case if you need an extra outfielder. And then Maverick Hanley as well, kind of back to that catcher revolving door is close to clearing protocol, concussion protocol. So hopefully you can get him back just as a clubhouse guy, some extra catching stability. Because right now the two catchers on the big league roster are not what you expected at the start of the season.
Yeah, and those two guys have performed admirably.
Definitely.
Especially, Alex Jackson has hit the ball really well. Jacob Stallings, I know, hasn't put up the best offensive numbers, but that's still a 10-year major league vet that, can just come right in. And Mansolino has really praised his work with the pitching staff right away, just being able to come in and adjust, and that's a hard thing to do. So those two guys, given the circumstances especially, have really performed admirably.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think that'll wrap a bow on our injury updates. But,
Please.
They will never, they seem to never stop coming. So we will see if we get any others before tonight's game. But we will also provide a little quick recap of the draft, since now we are a little over a week since our last podcast, recapping that first kind of 7 draft picks that the Orioles made, which is actually really huge to look back at how the draft has gone for the Orioles, because you have the Ike Irishes, the Vahiva Aloys, who you kind of expected a lot from. But you have now 7 of the Orioles that were drafted this year slot into Baseball America's top 30 Orioles prospect list. You have Ike Irish at number 5, which is ahead of Enrique Bradfield Jr. at number 6, which I found interesting. Vahiva Aloy at number 8, Caden Bodine at 11, Slater DeBrun at 12, Joseph Jurwa at 14, JT Quinn at 24, and then 4th rounder Colin Yeaman creeps in at number 25 on that Baseball America top 30 list. He is a shortstop from UC Irvine. One thing to note, too, of the 30 top prospects for the Orioles, according to Baseball America, 12 of them are pitchers. So you kind of knew that the Orioles might not have gone the route of getting some pitchers, but they did acquire some earliest on in the Mike Elias era. So it's good news to see when you get a guy like Joseph Jurwa, JT Quinn up there in that top 30 for the Orioles.
Yeah, this is, we talked about it on draft night. We talked about it in our podcast right after the draft. The Orioles had a chance to really do some damage with 4 picks in the top, and you see it in their top dozen prospects at this point. Joseph Jurwa, their highest drafted pitcher of the Mike Elias era as well, slots in as one of their top prospects too. The only prospect that hasn't signed among that group is Slater DeBrun. The Orioles have signed, I believe, 9 of their first top 10 round selections. Slater DeBrun being the only one they haven't signed at this point, but teams do have until Monday the 28th at 5 p.m. to sign all of their draft picks. This is a really talented high school outfielder that has a commitment to Vanderbilt, and if you are keyed into college baseball or just really have an outside perspective of college baseball, you know that Vanderbilt is one of the most respected and formidable programs in the country, and a lot of high schoolers understand the value of going to a program like that and developing there. And so if you are selecting a high schooler that has a commitment to Vanderbilt, especially a prospect as good as Slater DeBrun, you are probably going to need to go over slot to sway that player away from their commitment there. Now, I will say in the case of the Orioles, they haven't signed any of their draft picks outside of the top 10 rounds. And I would imagine that strategy has a lot to do with the fact that they really want Slater DeBrun to sign as the 37th overall pick, and they will need to go pretty significantly over slot to make that happen. They also went over slot with their 5th and 10th round picks. They went under slot on some other guys, and they have a lot of money to play with because with 4 picks in the top 37, they had the most slot money available to them in the MLB draft. If you're not super familiar with how the MLB draft works, teams are allocated a specific amount of money to sign their draft picks with. If they don't use it, it's not like they just get the money. And if a team doesn't sign a draft pick, it does not mean they are being cheap, because they either have the money and are able to use it to sign draft picks, or they lose the money and are not able to sign those draft picks. So there is nothing incentivizing the Orioles to not sign Slater DeBrun. They would rather have a guy that they feel like fell to them at number 37 than the 38th pick next year, which is what they would get if DeBrun does not sign. But still plenty of time to make that signing happen. Back to your original point, Annie, with what you were talking about, there are a lot of top prospects from this draft, and I think the Orioles really viewed this draft in particular as one where they could really bolster the farm system. We're going to talk about the trade deadline as a potential avenue to do that as well. But this was a draft with as many high selections as you had, and the bonus pool money that you had to work with where you could really, really bolster this farm system, and the Orioles have absolutely done that.
Right, and we talk about all the time, too, the difference between the draft and the trade deadline. And the draft is for bolstering the farm system and getting some raw, really great talent that's best player available, which is where we tend to see that strategy of draft the bat, trade for the arm. This year was different just because of how many picks early on that they had, where they had a little bit more wiggle room to get some pitchers and arms into the organization, which is going to be huge. And I think that when you look at how the draft went for the Orioles, you would probably grade it pretty highly just because of the diverse type of talent that they got. You got some players that you knew would fit the mold for an Orioles draft type of profile, but then you also got some guys which could bolster a little bit of a pitching need down the line and being able to develop pitching in this farm system, which we haven't necessarily seen so much in the Mike Elias era. But of course, it does lead to the conversation of the trade deadline, because now you have a wealth of new bats that you could use later down the road for some potential trades or as trade pieces, whether that's in the offseason or at the trade deadline. Obviously, it's probably very soon to be able to trade some new draft picks that you get in 2025, so don't count on that. But obviously, just bolstering the farm as a whole to be able to use those bats or even some arms later down the road for potential trade pieces is really crucial. And I think that was a huge part of the strategy that the Orioles were this year in the draft, not to mention just that they've had a lot of really key players graduate from the farm system.
Yeah, and this kind of plays into our conversation about the trade deadline as we transition into that part of our talk here. But nobody wants to be in this situation, right? Nobody in the front office or in the clubhouse thought they would be in a situation where they are sellers at the deadline. Nobody in the clubhouse wants to be moved or wants to be dealt. But it kind of affords you, oddly enough, a unique opportunity to bolster a farm system that has seen, as you mentioned, a lot of good players graduate. They have traded prospects away in order to acquire talent that they believed was going to help them win at the major league level. And to a large extent, they have done that. Corbin Burns, Trevor Rogers, Zack Efflin, those have been guys that have helped you win big league ball games. And ultimately, that is the point of the farm system. The point of the farm system is to get you big league talent, whether that is through the literal guys in the farm system that are promoted up to the big leagues and turn into talented major league players, or if that's trading for already established major league talent, with some of the prospects that have big league potential. So in a season that has not gone the way that you planned, you have both an MLB draft where you have the most bonus pool money of any team in the majors, and you can make a lot of big moves there to bolster a farm system that needs bolstering after a lot of the promotions and trades that have happened over the past few seasons. Couple that with a trade deadline where you are unexpectedly sellers and can bring in some top prospects as well. Again, it's not a situation you wanted to be in, but it's still a situation that you can turn advantageous and can, benefit you in a lot of big ways down the line.
Yeah, and I think unexpectedly being sellers is kind of the key phrase that you just used for where the Orioles stand right now, where you could say a couple of months ago or even earlier on in the season when you and I were discussing, okay, how can the Orioles still salvage this season and make it a successful season at that point in time? And at that point in time, you and I were throwing out some avenues and routes for the Orioles where it still felt like they had the chance to turn things around, maybe be buyers at the trade deadline, maybe be a little bit of both, do some buying and selling. We both agreed that I guess wherever you were at this point in time before the trade deadline, they weren't necessarily going to have to do a complete rebuild, and I think that still stands true. But at least right now, we kind of know where the Orioles are going to be come this trade deadline. And that comes with some confirmation from Mike Elias, who had an interview with MLB Network Radio on Sirius XM on the 20th. And he basically just said, listen, we are about 11 days away. That was back at the interview. We're about 11 days away from this trade deadline. We know how the season has gone. We know that our veterans who have expiring contracts are getting a lot of attention from a lot of other clubs. So we might as well be able to utilize that kind of opportunity. And that's kind of the only way that they know where they're going to go. And Mike Elias even said they're talking about everything, listening to everything, exploring opportunities, and they're trending in that direction. So he just said we just got to listen to the amount of value that the expiring contract players have.
Yeah, and that's not Elias naming specific players, right? But you're able to read between the lines a little bit based on what he said. A direct quote from him was, to the degree that we have players that interest other clubs that are coming towards the end of their contracts, we've got to listen to that. And you couple that with the fact that he also said we're not blowing up the team and we plan on being very good again in 2026, and we think we're going to be very good again in 2026. You understand what that means from Elias' standpoint, right? I wouldn't look at players at this deadline that are considered the core of this team. Tony Mansolino kind of echoed that sentiment as well, where the Orioles are in a unique situation where they believe the core of this team is good enough to win them a lot of ball games because it has done that over the past 2 seasons. So obviously names like Gunnar Henderson, Adley Rutschman, what guys are not going to go anywhere. And you also understand at the same time that if there are guys on expiring contracts and you are where you are in the standings right now, 12 games under, those are the guys that are going to garner interest from other clubs. They are good players that you brought in to help you potentially make a run in 2025. It didn't work out that way, and you are going to be able to get some good pieces back for those players. I think the interesting conversations, and probably the ones that we will be having over the next week or so, as we're now 8 days out from the trade deadline, are what to do with players that have 2 years of team control, that potentially have options for next season. I think that's where the interesting conversations come in. But in terms of the guys that are on expiring deals that will be free agents at the end of 2025, whether they're in an Orioles uniform or not, Mike Elias was very honest about the fact that those guys have value to other teams, and based on where the Orioles are in the standings and what the second half outlook looks like, you've got to see what that value is for those sorts of guys. So I think over the next 8 days, there is a little bit of an unfortunate reality that is setting in for a lot of guys. We have heard from, players like Ryan O'Hearn that have been pretty vocal about the fact that they don't want to be traded. They want to be here, right? Cedric Mullins has said the same thing. They don't want to be dealt. They want to be here. They want to win with this team. Tomoyuki Sugano said the same thing. They want to be winning with this team because that was the outlook for 2025. That's what everybody expected to happen, and it just didn't go that way. And so it's going to be a tough week because you are seeing what has come from the fact that this has been a disappointing first 100 games of the year. Nobody wants to be in this situation, but the situation they're in, and it's going to be a hard week, as mentioned, but that's where the Orioles find themselves at this point.
Yeah, and it says a lot, too, with guys like Tomoyuki Sugano and him saying that he doesn't want to leave this clubhouse. He already really loves this atmosphere and the team that he has joined for his first season in Major League Baseball. So it really says a lot when you hear players like Sugano and even veterans and leaders in this clubhouse like O'Hearn and Mullins say that they really just love this organization. So it really just means a lot, and it also makes it a little bit more of a tough pill to swallow, say something happens. Now, I'm not necessarily saying with either of those three guys, but just in general, like the trade deadline is never a fun period of time. And the players know that it's business. Everybody knows that that's the nature of the sport and the game. But I think that the biggest takeaway from what Elias said, at least in my opinion, is they're not changing the foundation of the team. And you mentioned that too. It's not going to be like the guys that hold the identity of this Baltimore organization since at least the Elias era. So I think that that's probably the biggest takeaway. And we talked about strategy and those avenues for the Orioles come the trade deadline. And I think a couple of months ago, we mentioned that it's not going to be a complete rebuild, but maybe some retooling. And I think that that's the biggest thing of what we can look to see from the Orioles in the next few days in this last week before the trade deadline. Is retooling is going to be huge, whether you're trading away guys for a pitcher, but maybe some guys who have expiring contracts, or also, like you mentioned, some guys that have some team control left. You can take a look at the example of the Trevor Rogers trade from last year, but from the Marlins perspective, where you're giving away someone with team control in Trevor Rogers, but you're getting back some young prospects who haven't necessarily proven themselves at the big league level yet, but end up being really, really crucial big league contributors. You can see that from Kyle Stowers right now for the Marlins.
Yeah, and I think the Orioles are in a bit of a different situation where, as mentioned, with Elias' comments about competing in 2026, I think it would come as a surprise if they do move on from guys with multiple years of team control. And with that being the case, you're probably not getting back a top 5-10 prospect in somebody's system if you're just talking about moving guys that are on expiring deals. And so I think as the trade deadline approaches, it's important to keep that in mind, just how many games are left in the regular season and going into the postseason for a lot of these teams that are going to be buyers. There is still value to be had in those types of moves. The Orioles aren't just going to give guys away. And the Orioles player development system is a darn good one. So if there is somebody that comes from another team that's their 25th ranked prospect and they enter the Orioles system, somewhere in the 20 to 30 range, I would be willing to wager that a prospect ranked 20 to 30 in the Orioles system might be more valuable than a prospect ranked 20 to 30 somewhere else, just because of what this player development staff has been able to do with prospects over the years. Point being, though, I think there needs to be a little bit of a brace period for the kinds of prospects that you're going to get in return for a lot of these key pieces, because they are on expiring deals and you're probably not moving anybody with team control. And I think that couples interestingly with the Orioles strategy in the draft, where you are potentially going overslot for somebody like Slater DeBrun with your 37th pick. You drafted really high-end talent with a lot of your first selections, especially on the position player side, where I think the draft is providing a lot of the top 15 prospects. I mean, Annie, you mentioned 5 or 6 of them that entered the top 15 in Baseball America's updated rankings, whereas the trade deadline might offer a lot of depth. You might see a lot of prospects ranked in that 15 to 30 range in an Orioles top 30 somewhere once we see the returns for a lot of these guys. So the draft may have given you a lot of the top prospects that you were able to select in the first few rounds like the Orioles did, and perhaps the trade deadline gives you a lot more depth in that farm system as well, and some potential arms or potential future big leaguers. So it's going to be an interesting strategy, but just wanted to throw out the kind of brace period for this trade deadline, where you've got to keep in mind that these guys are on expiring contracts that the Orioles are more than likely moving, and expiring contracts do not get a huge return because of the nature of how many games they are playing for the team that acquires them.
Right, and it also just kind of goes to show how important it is for this club to not focus on a complete rebuild, but also just move to the near future in 2026. Well, Brendan, I'm sure we're going to have much more in-depth discussions about this trade deadline in the next coming days and weeks, but thank you so much for taking the time over in Cleveland, and best of luck with the last 2 games of the series. But thank you so much to all of those who are tuning in live to this edition of The Bird's Nest. If you missed it live, you can also tune in and watch it back and listen to it back on Apple Music or Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast. But thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of The Bird's Nest, and we'll catch you next time.